Every man at the Borden Farrier Supply in Grady County, Oklahoma, had looked at the same pile of horseshoes that June morning. They sat in a rusted heap behind the supply shed. 200, maybe 250 of them, pulled shoes from dead and retired horses, some going back 15 years. Bent, pitted, coated in old hoof packing and red clay. The kind of thing you leave in a pile because it costs more to haul it away than it's worth. Butch Ellerly, who ran the supply operation and had been fitting shoes for going on 32 years, had been trying to get rid of that pile since 2009. He'd offered it to 2 scrap dealers. Both passed. The second one said he'd take it for free, and still didn't come back. Every man there that morning looked at the pile and saw the same thing. They saw dead weight, old iron with nothing left to give, and they were all looking at the same pile, thinking the same thought, and every one of them was wrong. The boy who showed up in a faded blue Ford Ranger, a 2003 with a rear bumper held on by a single bolt and a trailer hitch, was 15 years old. He went by Callum, not Cal, not Clem. Callum, which was the name his grandfather had carried, and his great-grandfather before that, all the way back to a family that had come through the Cherokee Strip in 1893 with a mule and a cast-iron pot and not much else. He drove up slow, looked at the pile through the windshield for a full minute before he got out, and then walked over and crouched down next to it the way an older man might. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. It was the second week of June, 2019. The temperature in Grady County that morning had already climbed to 87 degrees by 9 o'clock, and the air smelled like cut grass and diesel and the particular dry sweetness that comes off old iron baking in the sun. There were 4 men at Borden Farrier Supply that morning, beyond Butch himself. Dale Pryor, who ran a cow-calf operation out toward Chickasha, his son-in-law Kevin, a younger man who hadn't been in the county long enough to know everybody yet, a farrier from Tuttle whose name nobody remembered to write down, and Gibbs Sellers, who had been retired from the quarter-horse business for 6 years, but still came in on Thursdays to drink coffee and offer opinions nobody had asked for. The supply yard sat on a county road between 2 wheat fields. Nothing remarkable about it. A gravel lot. A corrugated metal building with Borden's name on a sign somebody had painted in the 1990s and never touched up. A bench out front under an overhang where the men sat with their cups. The scrap pile was around back, visible from the bench if you knew to look. Callum drove into that parking lot at 9:14 in the morning. He parked the Ranger, got out, walked around the side of the building, and crouched down next to the pile. He stayed there a while, not 30 seconds. Longer, he picked up a shoe, turned it over, set it down. He held one up to the light at an angle, examining something in the iron, the curve of it maybe, or the thickness where the shoe bent around the toe. He held it between his hands the way you'd hold a piece of pottery to feel the weight. He picked up another. He had a small spiral notebook in his shirt pocket, the cardboard cover kind you get at a dollar store, and he took it out and wrote something down. Dale Pryor watched him from the bench out front. He didn't say anything right away. That was the thing about Dale. He wasn't a cruel man, just an honest one, and honest men sometimes say things that land harder than cruelty because they're only reporting what they see. He said, loud enough to carry, "Boy, you know those are junk, right?" Callum looked up. He said he knew. Gibbs Sellers, who had been wrong about horses in ways that had cost him a fair amount of money over the years, but who remained confident in his assessments, said the pile wasn't worth the gas to haul it. He said that because he believed it. He had no reason not to. Callum said, "Yes, sir." He wrote something else in his notebook. He didn't look up when he said it. Not rude. Not a performance. Just quiet and careful, and not particularly interested in being talked out of something. Butch Ellerly came out of the supply shed wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the boy crouched next to his junk pile, and at the four men watching the boy like they'd found a reasonable source of entertainment for a slow Thursday morning. Butch had a practical mind. He said he'd sell the whole thing for $40 cash, and the understanding that Callum was responsible for loading and hauling it himself. There were 227 shoes in that pile. Butch had counted them once, years before, out of boredom. At $40, that worked out to less than 18 cents per shoe. Callum said he'd take it. He had two 20s folded together in the front pocket of his jeans, and he handed them over without fishing around for them. He had planned for exactly this. Gibbs Sellers laughed. Not cruel. Not mean-spirited. Just the particular sound of a man who had been in the horse business long enough to think he knew what old iron was worth, and who found it faintly amusing when someone disagreed. Callum loaded every one of those 227 shoes into the bed of the Ranger by hand, making 4 trips from the pile to the tailgate. He didn't ask for help, and nobody offered it. It took him 45 minutes in 87-degree heat. He tied the load down with a single length of baling twine from behind the seat. He shook Butch Ellerly's hand, nodded at the men on the bench, and drove away south on the county road. Gibbs Sellers watched the Ranger until the dust settled. He told Dale Pryor he didn't know what a teenager was going to do with a truck full of scrap horseshoes. Dale said he didn't either. Kevin said nothing. The farrier from Tuttle had already gone inside. Nobody thought much more about it after that. The Harpe family had a place about 9 miles southeast of Chickasha, in the part of Grady County where the red clay flats give way to a little more timber, and the draws have water in them most of the year. 280 acres, mostly pasture, with a windbreak of blackjack oaks along the north fence, and a creek that ran reliably from February through July, and then mostly quit. The Harps had been out there since 1941. Callum's grandfather, Raymond Harp, had bought the original 80 acres with mustering out pay from the Army and never left. He'd added acreage when he could afford it, in pieces, 40 acres in 1953, another 60 in 1967, the last 80 from the estate of a neighbor who died without children in 1979. Raymond farmed wheat and ran a small herd of Hereford cattle and kept horses because he loved them, not for income. He raced a little in the small track county fair circuit, which is a different world entirely from anything you'd see at Remington Park or Lone Star. He just liked horses. He liked being around them, and he liked understanding them, and he kept 3 or 4 of his own right up until his last year. Raymond Harp was also a blacksmith. Not a farrier, exactly, a blacksmith. There is a difference, and Raymond was particular about it his whole life. A farrier fits shoes to living horses. A blacksmith makes things from iron. They are related trades the way carpentry and cabinet making are related, overlapping but not the same, and the distinction matters to the people inside them. Raymond had learned under his own father, Eldon Harpe, who had learned under a man named Cecil Press, who shod draft horses in Pottawatomie County before the roads were paved and the tractor replaced the horse in the fields. Raymond had a coal forge and a barn out back that he'd built himself in 1957 out of a converted washtub, fire brick, and a blower he'd salvaged from a dairy barn that was being torn down in Caddo County. He had a post vise that weighed 212 pounds, bolted to a section of elm post set in concrete. He had a hammer rack with 5 hammers on it, each with a handle he'd shaped himself from hickory, each weighted and balanced to a specific task. He kept his tools oiled and wrapped in canvas when they weren't being used, and he sharpened and dressed them the way a surgeon might maintain instruments, not obsessively, but with a certain respect for what good tools were worth. He also had a notebook. Actually, he had 32 of them, the same cardboard cover spiral kind his grandson would later carry in his shirt pocket. Raymond Harp wrote down everything he made, everything he tried, every time a technique worked and every time it didn't, and why. When he found a heat range that gave him a good forge weld on horseshoe iron, he wrote the color of the metal and the time at temperature and what the joint looked like when it cooled. When he tried something from an old manual and it didn't work, he wrote that down too, and why he thought it hadn't. He was a careful man with language. The notebooks weren't elegant, the handwriting was compact, and the grammar was a working man's grammar, not a schoolteacher's. But the information in them was precise, in the way that things written down for yourself are precise, not worried about an audience, just trying to get it right. The 32 notebooks filled a wood crate on the top shelf in the barn. They covered 37 years of blacksmithing, from 1977 to 2014. The last entry was dated March 4th of that year, a note about the behavior of a particular lot of mild steel rod he'd bought from a supplier in Anadarko. Raymond died of a coronary in his own driveway in October 2014. He was 81. He'd been out on the four-wheeler checking the north fence line, came back, got off the machine, and his heart stopped. Callum's mother found him. Callum was 9 years old. He didn't understand all of it yet. He cried for a week and then he went quiet, the way some children go quiet around grief, and his mother gave him room. What he did in the months after was start spending time in the barn, not building anything, just sitting in it. The forge was cold, the tools were wrapped. But Raymond's handwriting was in the notebooks, and the notebooks were on the shelf, and Callum could read. By the time he was 11, he had read most of them. By the time he was 13, he understood most of what he'd read. That distinction matters. Raymond's notes referenced techniques that required heat control and feel that only came from hours at the forge. You could read about fire scale and decarburization all day long. At some point, you had to make the mistake yourself to understand why the note was in the notebook. Callum made the mistakes. He rebuilt the forge with new fire bricks he'd bought second-hand from a pottery supply in Norman, $40 for a mixed lot that he hauled home in a feed bag. He got the blower running again. He burned through a winter of coal and a spring of propane and a lot of bad welds and improperly worked iron before things started coming out the way he intended. What he was making, once he started making things that held together, was decorative ironwork. Hooks and holders at first, because they were simple and because Raymond had a full section in the 1989 notebook on small forge work. Then, more complex things. He worked with what he had, which was a small assortment of stock from the supply yard and whatever old iron he could find at sales and farm clearances. Old horseshoe iron was, he had learned from Raymond's notebooks, particularly good material for this kind of work. The note was in volume 14, written in 1991. Mild steel, low carbon, good movement under heat, welds clean if the temperature is right, holds surface detail because the iron is soft enough to take impression without fighting the hammer. Raymond had been collecting and working pulled shoes his whole career. He thought they were some of the finest raw material a working blacksmith could get hold of if he was patient enough to accumulate them. The section ran 4 pages. Callum had copied it out by hand into a new notebook, flagged with a torn piece of feed sack. He had been selling ironwork for a year and a half by the time he drove to Borden Farrier Supply. The sales had started by accident, a set of wall hooks for his mother, made from two pulled thoroughbred shoes he'd found at a county sale, curved and fitted with a knuckle detail he'd worked out over 2 weekends of attempts. His mother put them in the kitchen. A woman from her church asked where she'd come from. Callum's mother said her son had made them in the barn. The woman asked if he'd make her a set. Callum said he'd try. She asked what he'd charge. He said $30 for 4 hooks, which was low. He knew it was low even at 15, because he'd looked up what ironwork sold for in some of the shops in Oklahoma City. But he was not yet confident enough to charge what the work was worth. He had kept records of every sale in the back pages of his notebook, because Raymond had been specific in several entries that a man who makes things should know his numbers as well as his craft. 41 sales by June 2019. The most expensive was a fireplace surround panel he'd made for a woman in Edmond. Horseshoes opened flat, worked thin, and fitted into a geometric pattern with a rosette at each intersection, and she had paid him $460 for it. His material cost on that piece had been $11.40. The iron had come from a box lot at an estate sale in Stevens County. He had paid $6 for the box. He had done the math before he drove to Borden's. He knew what he could do with 227 shoes. He knew what those pieces would sell for, on the low end, if he worked carefully and priced honestly. He had written the number in his notebook the night before. The number was not 18 cents per shoe. He unloaded the Ranger into the barn that afternoon. He sorted the shoes into the wooden crates he'd made with dividers, by size, by thickness, by the condition of the toe and the branches, because Raymond's notes were emphatic that sorting iron before using it saved time and prevented waste. He knew within 2 hours of being home what he had. Not exactly, but close enough to know that $40 had been the right price to pay. He fired the forge that same evening and started working. The man who came to understand what was in that barn 8 months later was Gibb Sellers. This was January 2020, and it started with a phone call Gibb's granddaughter made from Oklahoma City, where she worked for a small interior design firm that did residential work for clients with more money than rural Oklahoma was accustomed to seeing. She was looking for custom ironwork, something with genuine material history, she told Gibb. Her client wanted a wall piece, not a reproduction, not something stamped out of a factory in China and antiqued with a chemical bath. Something real, made by someone who knew what they were doing with iron that had been somewhere. Gibb mentioned it at Borden's on the second Thursday of January, more as conversation than as a genuine search. He did not immediately connect this request to the boy with the rusted pile, because there was no particular reason he should have. Butch Ellerly was the one who made the connection. He came out of the supply shed and stood in the doorway and said, "You might try that Harp kid, the one who bought my junk pile last summer." The bench went quiet for a moment. Gibb said, "The teenager." Butch said yes. Gibb sat with that for a few seconds. He was not a man who made a show of being wrong. He just called Callum's mother that afternoon because he didn't have a direct number, and she gave him one, and he drove out to the Harp place 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon in cold January light. Callum walked him to the barn and slid the door open on its track. What was in there took Gibb longer than he expected to take in. Along the interior walls, on a shelving system built from reclaimed 2x4s and held together with lag bolts and pipe brackets that Callum had made himself, there were pieces. Finished pieces and pieces in progress, and pieces waiting for the last pass of a file or a coat of beeswax finish. Wall panels, candle holders, coat hooks by the dozens, stacked in groupings by style. A garden gate panel, 3 feet by 4 feet, that Callum told him had taken 19 hours across 4 sessions. a set of fire tools with handles that tapered to a four-sided twist and ended in a forged ball, a towel bar with forged leaf ends, an entry door handle set, 2 pieces, that had been commissioned by someone in Edmond and hadn't been picked up yet. The material in nearly every piece was old horseshoe iron. Gibb walked along the shelving slowly. He was 68 years old, and he had been in the horse business in Grady County for 40 years, and he knew iron when he saw it. He knew worked iron, too. He had shod his own horses for years before he got too old for the bending. He could tell the difference between something made by someone who understood the material and something hammered out by someone who didn't. He stopped in front of the gate panel and looked at it for a while. He asked Callum what something like that sold for. Callum said it depended on the work involved, but that piece would go for somewhere between $900 and $1,200, depending on the buyer. Gibb nodded. He looked at the hooks. He asked about those. $40 to $60 for a single hook, $80 to $100 for a matched pair. Gibb did the math on the shelf in front of him. Not all of it, but enough. He told his granddaughter about Callum that same evening. She drove down from Oklahoma City 4 days later with a camera and a tape measure and a client's brief. She spent 2 hours in the barn. She bought 4 pieces outright, paying Callum a total of $640 in cash that she pulled from an envelope she'd brought for the purpose. She photographed 12 others and sent the images to her client that evening from the parking lot of a gas station in Chickasha on her way back north. The fireplace surround panel sold to the client in Oklahoma City for $1,200. Callum's cut was $900. He was 16 years old. The interior firm put his name in a file they kept of craftspeople worth knowing. That file had 17 names in it, and Callum was the youngest by 30 years. His granddaughter didn't advertise him. But she mentioned him to colleagues, and colleagues mentioned him to clients, and by the summer of 2020, Callum had a list of 7 commissions ahead of him, and had raised his prices for the first time. He raised them again in 2021. He is more comfortable with that now. Raymond Harpy's notebooks are still in the barn. All 32, in the same wood crate on the top shelf where they have been since Raymond put the last one there in 2014. Callum has added 7 of his own now. He uses the same cardboard cover spiral kind. He writes in the same compact hand his grandfather used, though he has his own abbreviations and his own way of noting temperatures. Fahrenheit, where Raymond used visual descriptions of color, which Callum always thought was more accurate anyway, and has started doing himself. He is 19 at the time of this telling. He runs a custom metalwork operation out of the same barn, with the same post vise, with the same coal forge his grandfather built from a salvaged washtub in 1957. He does 60 to 65 pieces a year, and the prices range from $40 for a simple hook to just under $3,000 for the large architectural panels. He has a waiting list that runs 4 months. He does not advertise. He has a phone number that gets passed quietly between people who have seen his work and want to tell someone else about it. The 2003 Ranger is still in the driveway. The bumper is fixed. What Callum Harp paid for 227 rusted horseshoes from a junk pile at Borden Farrier Supply in June of 2019 was $40. What has come back from that investment in 3 years of finished ironwork is something north of $41,000. The math is not complicated. Gibb Sellers has offered to do it himself for anyone who's curious. He says he's had some practice. Raymond Harpe never told his grandson that the iron business would be worth anything. He didn't make promises about trades. He just showed him how to read the iron, how to pick up a piece of used metal and understand what it still had to give, how to sort it and heat it and work it until it was something it hadn't been before. He wrote it all down in 32 notebooks because he thought it was worth writing down. Because the people who taught it to him hadn't written it down, and he'd had to learn some of it the hard way. Some things look like junk right up until the moment they don't. The trick, Raymond used to say, was knowing which pile to crouch down next to, and staying there long enough to read it right. That was about as close as he got to advice. Everything else he just put in the notebooks.